As I mentioned last week, this is a journey through the rich history of Australian art, seen through the collection galleries of the Queensland Art Gallery. Now, the way that these galleries are installed requires us to look for singular works or small clusters of works in each room in terms of telling some kind of history rather than a sweeping kind of progressive story. Now, today we're going to focus on, actually shift our focus from the outside to the inside and also explore the manifestations of modernity and modernism within Australia. First, let's recap. Last week, we explored the theme of landscape through some very different examples of aesthetic philosophies and styles. We discussed how the genre of landscape paintings took such a strong hold in Australia as an expression of national ideals and problematics, as well as the absence of the grand historical themes, battles, and religious histories of European art. But another great impact on our artists and our art history is the impact of modernity and modernism. Now, I want to leap into some definitions here. Modernity and modernism are two very different terms. Modernity expresses a sense of modern life, which often means the city or increasing industrialization and the impact that this has had on people's lives. Socially, the world of work was changing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with things like the 5-day work week, creating newly segmented parts of life to be used for leisure. Now, the works that are brought to mind that identify with this sense of modernity are those classic works of French Impressionism by Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, Seurat, of the 1860s, 70s and 80s. You know, these are street scenes full of people promenading along or relaxing along the Seine, boulevards, cafes, parks, these suburban kind of pleasure grounds. Now, this quote from Charles Baudelaire really kind of sums some of these sentiments up. Now, the paintings of these Impressionists, the French Impressionists, are seen as an attempt to give form to that modernity and seek out its typical representatives, which might be barmaids, boaters, prostitutes, sightseers, or the petit bourgeois lunching on the grass. In addition to these subjects, these artists also eschewed, good drawing and the approved level of finish to their works. Instead, exploring casual and impressionistic manners of making work, like the idea of presenting a sketch as a finished work, quite revolutionary for that time. Now, I want to actually go back a slide. This is a group of Australian works that actually, interestingly, include many of those Impressionist themes. We have the locations here, which are classic. We have Venice. There's a St. Mark's Cathedral there by E. Phillips Fox. Below that is Pont Neuf by Ethel Carrick Fox. We've got the middle work is Charles Conder in North Africa. So a lot of artists were traveling through these grand tour kind of locations at this time. Below that are a couple of works by Phillips Fox that explore that great motif of blossom and spring blossom, which is such an impressionist subject. And then on our left-hand side, we have two works by John Russell, which are of the south of France, Belle Isle. So this is a wonderful work by Russell. Now, you wouldn't have thought that in the early 20th century, John Russell, he was pretty much completely unknown. He had been a friend of Vincent van Gogh and a mentor to Henri Matisse, had followed Monet to this location and was painting in that manner. So it's hard to believe that when he died at home in Sydney in 1930, he was virtually unknown here in his homeland. Now, the gallery actually has a magnificent collection of works by John Russell. You can see here, this work's in the credit line. It's a gift of Lady Trout. So Lady and Sir Leon and Lady Trout were very wealthy collectors and were able to gift many works, and some of them were purchased by the Queensland Art Gallery later on. So that is a reason why certain collectors and art lovers would come to Queensland Art Gallery to see these works in particular. But now let's move on to the notion of modernism. So modernism is quite a different idea. It's characterized by the more philosophical implications of what these new understandings of the world might hold. It's experimental and elevates ideas of challenge and critical autonomy and creative innovation. And this questioning mode kind of sets it apart from the traditional cultural imperatives, accepted conventions, or academic rules that ensured that forms of cultural standards and hierarchies were being maintained. Modernism's challenge is that the idea of these rules, precedents, or shared parameters are no longer needed to govern or guide future cultural expression. But the past is not simply forgotten or eliminated. Instead, works of the past are treated as a kind of archive of possibilities that can be freely adopted, reevaluated, remade, and reworked. Modernism, taking it to its extreme, even then questions what art is and might be. It's now pretty common for us to assume that art, especially contemporary art, will test our established ways of perceiving things or even the establishment itself. And that idea is the result of modernism. So here we have a wonderful group of works from the collection. These are all along the subject of women. We've got left is Phillips Fox, in the middle is Rupert Bunny, and on the right hand side is Amy Bale. Now this entire wall, interestingly, depicts a certain kind of modern idea of women taking hold. But the work I wanted to look at most carefully is these works by and sorry, across here, this is on the perpendicular wall, we have Godfrey Rivers on the right, in the middle and the left, works by Josephine Muntz Adams. Actually, first I'll be talking about Muntz Adams. You know, last week we talked about Winifred Rumney's work as one of the major colonial paintings in the collection and by a woman artist. And here we have the first painting by an Australian artist to be purchased for the Queensland Art Gallery's collection, and it's also by a woman artist. Muntz Adams painted this work in Europe, and it was shown in the Paris Salon of 1893, and also shown in the Queensland International Exhibition in 1897. Now, whilst there's been some debate about the sitter's identity, it's likely the artist's mother, and we can see this kind of sentimental aspect of this painting that was so popular during this very particular history of the Queensland Art Gallery. Last week, we talked about that first work that had been acquired, you know, at all by British artist Blandford Fletcher's Evicted, which had been bought 2 years earlier. And this work is kind of along those similar lines in terms of thinking about these sentimental themes. This is the kind of work that's coming out of our major art school in Australia at that time, which is the National Gallery School in Melbourne. It's very Victorian, I mean, in terms of the time period, really. It's figurative, it's full of sentiment and quite over the top. Now, here is a very different kind of picture, also by a woman artist and with women as its subject, and now it's hung quite close by. Leisure Moments is dated 1902, and it's an intimate portrayal of Amy M.E. Bale's lifestyle at a time when she was also studying at the National Gallery School in Melbourne. She was studying under Rupert Bunny. But here she's posing her subjects as figures also occupied within the scene, but they're not passive. They're also being painted in the context of creative labor within an artist's studio. They're painted, this work is kind of painted in a very traditional manner for its time, but I think that we see that creeping influence and a hint of new attitudes coming through. Firstly, you know, this is a women's space. It's not a battlefield. It's not a grand kind of history painting or a pioneering landscape of the Australian Impressionists. You know, Frederick McCubbin at this time is teaching and very influential on these artists, but this isn't one of those kinds of big pioneering kind of pictures. This is a different space, women in a kind of private moment. And I think it's interesting in that this prefigures what is to come with the burgeoning modernist movement. You know, this is 1902. There's always this kind of time lag that happens within, you know, those ideas making their way from France and Europe into Australia. But here we see it's starting to happen. Now, also within the context of this display, I really did want to point out the story of the Harvey School, which also points to the stories of decorative arts and furniture within these displays and museum displays. Now, as art historian Peter McNeill has described, and I'm quoting here, objects face multiple challenges within art historical study. It's partly because they neither fit easily within a scientific paradigm or a departmental structure nor canon, and also because they cross disciplinary fields, ranging from art history itself to anthropology, material culture design studies, and fashion studies, as well as, you know, this idea of the decorative arts. Now, reading and creating meaning from examples of both high and low Australian culture, say teapots or burley corsetry, advertising or trade catalogues, was undertaken in Australia with great energy in the 1980s and early 90s, with an agenda that was driven by feminism, as well as the kind of interrelations of social, labour, consumer and economic histories. And our institutional exhibitions have also accorded increasing prominence to Australian design since the 1980s. We now see integrated displays like this with furniture and decorative arts integrated alongside paintings and sculptures, so-called high arts. We see these displays at the National Gallery of Victoria, Art Gallery of South Australia. And it's interesting, Sydney is a different kind of example, as those collections are pretty much divided between the powerhouse, now known as the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. But curator and art historian Mary Eagle has signalled most forcefully that the understanding of a particular period of Australian art can't exist without the recognition of the role of the applied arts. And by this we, of course, mean design, advertising and fashion. In 1978, she argued that modernism entered Australian art not through the hallowed reaches of high art, but through their secondary manifestation in fashion goods for a growing consumer market. And she cited Home magazine as the compelling example of that commingling of art and design, and which the modern was espoused as both fashionable and desirable. But really, we don't really have that kind of display here in the galleries of that kind of modern design that was highlighted in the Home magazine. But this group of objects has so much to tell us about a very particular period of Brisbane's art history. The kind of pottery that was being taught at L.J. Harvey's classes from 1916 at the Brisbane Central Technical College, this was hand-built, forged from an appreciation of the arts and crafts movement that had originated in 1888 in London, inspired by people like John Ruskin and, of course, you know, William Morris, who advocated the simplification of design of every object in opposition to the kind of elaborately ornamented items fostered by the Industrial Revolution and the degradation of skills as well that had been forced upon people. So this decorative impulse merged with the desire of women to create artistic environments within their homes. Wood carving, as we saw in that previous slide, becomes it really developed a huge impetus here in Australia, and is seen in the plethora of furniture that's carved from these rich timber resources that we also saw last week in terms of discussing Ryan Presley's work that explored that northern New South Wales the logging of the red cedar, and that wonderful also Joseph Sobolewski display table, which was a kind of, you know, advertisement for these beautiful timbers that could be, you know, exploited basically as resources. So, but this, back to the story of the women of L.J. Harvey's school. During both World Wars, these extraordinary women, and I just love this image, I hope everybody else does as well, they're making objects to fundraise for the war effort. They're doing enormous amounts of volunteering, including with the Red Cross, where they teach returned soldiers, often in the military hospital just across the way at Kangaroo Point. This then leads to the University of Queensland to establish a course in occupational therapy, which was then later formally instituted in 1955. So it's a history that had a huge impact, particularly on women here in Brisbane. Now, Daphne Mayo here was one of Harvey's students. She also, as you might know, carved the tympanum of the Brisbane City Hall and the Queensland Women's War Memorial in Anzac Square, and actually also was really in the formation of the gallery's collection, setting up a collection fund with Vital AE. This is her Olympian of circa 1946, but cast actually much later. We can see that this is it's a strong, athletic women's body. She is quoted as saying that the human body is a superlative piece of sculpture. And of course, this work illustrates that view. There's two variations upon this work. One is in the National Gallery of Victoria's collection, and they both kind of differ slightly. There's also been some speculation that this casting of the Olympian might have coincided with the 1956 Olympic Games that was held in Melbourne, but we don't know for sure. The body, as we can see here, as a subject becomes a kind of new subject within art, a new treatment of the body. These hierarchies are eliminated, and we see different kinds of bodies become subjects within art, not just historical, heroized subjects, although there is an echo of that within this work, or holy or spiritual ciphers, or idealized portraits of aristocrats. The body's then, you know, almost released from those kinds of constraints, and we're able to see new bodies as subjects in art. So I want to move down to, I suppose, you know, these major expressions of modernism within Australian art. And it's interesting that this particular aspect of the display focuses on Sydney as being emblematic of a new modern sensibility, which is helped along by, of course, these icons being constructed like the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Here, Roland Wakeland's bridge under construction demonstrates the principles of synchronism. And he was influenced by artists like Paul Cézanne. And of course, you know, Cubism is also having a big impact at this time, the work of Picasso and Braque, but later Lotte and Glaise, the late Cubists, are also very influential within the development of these artists. Now, it's often said that it was women artists who drove the establishment of modern art in Australia. And of course, as I mentioned, those two world wars and the impact of those in the first half of the century have a great deal to do with that. As contrasted with our received understandings of the development of landscape painting in Australia, this is very much an art of an urban city kind of context. And here within this display, Sydney is really the locus in many ways. Firstly, let's look at this wonderful Grace Crowley. This is perhaps quite a later work within Crowley's career, but it's an extraordinary one. Now, she'd been born into a well-off family of graziers on the land, and she, of course, rejects this idea of settling down and getting married in favour of an independent life as an artist. She trained at Gillian Ashton's art school, which is a very traditional kind of art school of this time. But she travels and goes to France in 1926 with her close friend Anne Dangar. and they make a pilgrimage to Cézanne's studio at Aix-en-Provence, and this is the reasoning why Dangar wants to go to France, but Crowley kind of tags along, intending to study at one of the more conservative art schools. But her entire idea of where she wanted to go as an artist is changed by these years. And in 1930, she returns to Australia as a champion of modernism, establishing her own art school in Sydney and becoming also one of the first Australian artists to paint purely abstract works. She'd been called back by her family, who'd been providing her with a living allowance, which was kind of essential for many of these women who were cosmopolitan at this time. They did that because they were able to financially to travel and not have to work. And she recalled that these ultra-modern works that she brought back with her were really generally not understood. She teaches for quite a few years, but then after the closure of the Crowley and Fazell School, her and Ralph Balson begin painting together exclusively in her city studio. And from this time onwards, their work becomes quite close stylistically, and they begin working towards creating purely abstract paintings. And once they'd made that leap into abstraction, this commitment kind of remains. Now, this within the context of the 1940s, these avant-garde geometric abstracts are very poorly received, really. And it's not until the 1950s, when Crowley's in her 60s, that a public gallery even exhibits her abstract works. Here is Ralph Balson, her partner in art, and he's credited with holding the first solo exhibition of purely abstract work in Australia. He was initially Crowley's pupil, and his entirely abstract exhibition was held in 1941, a few years before this work, which is dated 1947. He called these works constructive paintings, and they're very much concerned with that push and pull, as Crowley's are, with the shapes and planes and colours, paying close attention to the way that they advance and recede, those different warm and cool hues, and the layering of these two-dimensional shapes creates an illusion of three-dimensional depth. Okay, also within this display is Crowley's friend, Anne Dangar. This is a ceramic work by Dangar, who travelled with Crowley to France in the mid-20s, also had to come back to Australia, but for her it was to find work and to support herself. She wasn't as wealthy as many of her friends and wasn't able to be supported by her family. But in 1930, she receives an invitation from the French kind of late Cubist Albert Glaise to join his community in rural France. And she immediately embraces this it's actually kind of more so like a commune, an artistic, both artistic and spiritual community in a way. And they have these ideals of creativity and self-sufficiency. She gives up painting to concentrate on pottery, initially because she couldn't afford materials, but then this becomes her medium. And this is a wonderful plaque, but she also made lots of very useful vessels throughout her lifetime, which are now been collected avidly by our state and national institutions. Now, let's move quickly through this wonderful work by Godfrey Miller, Figure Study, which of course gives us a sense of these the principles of cubism, of fragmenting the picture plane, of really kind of analytically pulling apart the subjects of the work so that things are reduced to just incredibly small elements within Miller's works. And here's Raphael, who Crowley had taught alongside. This work is very much about the embrace of Cubist methods. We can see that he owes much to the influence actually here of André Lotte and Albert Glaise through Grace Crowley. So, you know, this history is really fascinating, with so many artists moving back and forth from Australia to Europe to learn and absorb the tenets of modernism. It's a particular interest of mine, and I'm learning all the time also about previously unknown artists from this period, and, making a few really interesting discoveries. So please keep an eye out for those. Now, I didn't have a chance last week to talk about these works from Groot Island, just to make a leap to the other side of the galleries, the long wall, which has the development or, explorations of landscape within Australia. But these works are very material to the history that we're talking about. These works are from Groot Island community, which it was named by Abel Tasman. It means large island in Dutch. It's in the Gulf of Carpentaria and lies 50 kilometres off the coast of Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. Now, the natural abundance of manganese oxide in the region features within these very beautifully distinct black backgrounds of these paintings. Now, the seafaring people of the island depict constellations, seasonal winds, celestial waters, and totemic animals. And these are intricately painted forms over these black surfaces. Now, bark painting within this region grew in popularity throughout the 40s and 50s and was championed by an amateur ethnographer, as well as anthropologist Charles Mountford. He argued that these paintings should be collected by Australia's state galleries rather than just housed as artefacts in museums. That's a fascinating history. So these works were collected, and of course have come into the Queensland Art Gallery's collection in the 50s. Now, unfortunately, the production of bark paintings within this community really started to decline with the mining boom of that area in the 1960s. And of course, that wonderful rich black of that manganese oxide of these particular bark paintings is exactly what makes it of interest to, the mining industry that then comes to the island. But what I'd also like to point out is the perspective from which these works are painted. Okay, so we have no horizon line within a kind of thinking about landscape. There's no sense of a vanishing point or Cartesian perspective. And many artists look towards Indigenous cultures, First Nations cultures for inspiration in terms of thinking of new ways and different ways of imagining what a painting might be and how to depict different subject matter. So that traces way back to, of course, artists like Picasso, results in many kind of more unfortunate descriptors of works as primitive, whereas in fact they're incredibly kind of sophisticated. But that's all part of this history of modernism in particular, of artists, searching for new ways of depicting different subjects. What I also wanted to point out here, which is very close by on this wall, is this work by Nimbunduck. Now, this is from the whole other side of Arnhem Land at the very top of Australia, in Wadeye or Port Keats. And this work, his work, Nimbunduck's work, became to be collected by Professor W.E.H. Stanner in the 1930s. No, he started collecting from the 1950s onwards. So Bunduck primarily, as we can see here, is working with ochres on bark, but also in this case, this is on kind of masonite, basically. And this work is described as a totemic map of the artist's country and belief systems, interpreting his extensive knowledge of Aboriginal culture, society, and very particularly law, in terms of a kind of explanation to Stanner, so that Stanner can better understand Aboriginal belief systems, philosophies, and aspirations. And I think in this work, even more emphatically, we can see the kind of amazing points of view that we're looking at from how this work is painted. One minute we're kind of looking down, the next it's across, and then there's this kind of radiating sense of perspective from those central circles. So this kind of fracturing of traditional perspective from a Western tradition, incredibly influential for, and also on Australian artists as well, from Margaret Preston to Ian Fairweather, of course. And these works, of course, predate the most amazing Papunya art movement of the 1970s, which we'll explore next week. But there's this struggle in terms of whether to consider these works, you know, ethnographic and deserving of being in museums. But many people like Mountford, like also Tony Tuxon in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, are trying to make their galleries and institutions appreciate these works as accomplished artworks in their own right, which is what they are. Now also to point towards the work of Albert Namatjira, interestingly within this context, you know, the founder of the incredibly important Hermannsburg School, whose initial working with Rex Batterby, a landscape watercolor painter, but then Namatjira, of course, takes that medium and just takes it into completely different kind of territory and new territory. Whilst these works in some ways might seem, and they are incredibly accomplished watercolors within this medium, they can seem to be quite conventional kinds of landscapes, but the more that we learn about Namatjira and also the family members that have gone on to create incredible bodies of works themselves, the particular features, the trees, the features of the landscape that he chooses, those choices that he's making to depict these particular areas are absolutely from within his own traditional knowledge and have so much meaning within that very specific cultural context. Now, there's an entire wonderful gallery 2, that's devoted to this particular school. And I also, we won't spend too much time talking about that today, but I wanted to point out that a recent development within that work, we can see within the credit line here that the copyright is with the Namatjira Legacy Trust. So only just recently, the family members of Albert Namatjira have had the rights to his artwork returned to them, which ends a struggle that had been going on for decades. He died in 1959, and the public trustee of the Northern Territory government took on administration of his estate. And Legend Press continued to manage the copyright and royalty payments to the Namatjira family. But later that public trustee sold the copyright to Legend Press in 1983 without consulting the family, and ended that income stream, you know, to the artist family. Namatjira is one of Australia's most famous and most well reproduced artists, and that was not going to his descendants, which was an incredible crime. And this later, the trustee acknowledged that that decision had been wrong. And major institutions had been restricted from reproducing these works, but of course that has just recently changed and is an incredible kind of development within this very particular community and tradition. Okay, so we're going to leap back to another side of the gallery and discuss the Antipodians in Melbourne in particular. Now, it's very much an oversimplification to turn this into a bit of a Sydney-Melbourne kind of rivalry, but the way that the gallery is actually also quite installed at the moment, it kind of lends itself to this and gives us a framework to begin with, and we can then, you know, add more nuance to that later. But okay, of course, in Melbourne, by contrast, a different kind of modernism is developing. And in February 1959, 7 artists and 1 historian came together to defend the tradition of the image in art. The context for the Antipodean group and its single exhibition, Antipodians, at the Victorian Arts Society in 1959, was the perception that abstract art was making advances with critics and audiences in Australia and abroad. Now, this group of artists were friends, but the catalyst was Bernard Smith, who was an art historian at the University of Melbourne and wrote an incredible book, Place, Taste and Tradition, in 1945. An analysis, a socio-economic analysis of Australian art from colonial and scientific beginnings to the onrush of the modern movement. It's a landmark work of art history, probably the first proper, well-realised work of Marxist art criticism, and it's also where the term postmodernism was first coined. Now, these artists were Charles Blackmon, Arthur Boyd, David Boyd, John Brack, Robert Dickerson, John Percival, and Clifton Pugh. See if you can see the pattern within that group of artists. They're all men, of course. Dickerson lived and worked in Sydney, didn't attend the meetings of the group. So, of course, already, you know, there's someone from Sydney. They were all aged between 30 and 40 in 1959 and saw themselves as representative of Australian cultural identity and concerned that with the growing interest and popularity of abstract art, that their own work was being marginalised. They made a manifesto, which they signed, and we see that this work is informed by social realism and an expressionist approach, and to some extent surrealism as well, but not to that kind of degree. They all share, as we see, a commitment to the figurative image. Now, the name Antipodians is an interesting one, very strategic and kind of provocative. And here we have the work by Albert Tucker, Study of Images for Modern Evil, Spring in Fitzroy. Tucker's images, these images by Tucker, it's a series, they reduce women to prostitutes or caricatures. He didn't actually see any teenage girls seducing men in the streets. You know, we can see when this is painted, 43, but decided to depict this kind of sense of moral depravity of that particular period of the time of the Second World War. Here we have 2 works by Charles Blackmon, which are currently on display. These works were actually painted in Brisbane. Now, the Blackmons, Charles and his wife Barbara, lived mostly in Melbourne, but also were in London for a time and in Brisbane actually for many years. And this is where they met. Barbara went to Brisbane State High School and then the University of Queensland. She was the one who introduced Charles to local artists and poets. He went on to exhibit regularly here at the Johnston Gallery in Bowen Hills, which was just on Sintra Road. And I hope that I have an image of the Alice. I don't as an individual image, but here we see her on the left. The Blue Alice, which is a wonderful painting. And it's seen as really a hymn to Barbara Blackmon, his wife, because her sight had degenerated quite quickly from her early 20s, and eventually she became blind. Okay. Let me return my PowerPoint. There we go. Here's the Arthur Boyd that we discussed last week. So we can see that there's these ideas about the unconscious, you know, the life of the psyche, the mythology within these works and this particular history of art. And also, you know, we're talking here in terms of the manifestation of the Antipodians is a kind of opposition between abstraction and figuration. It's not as simply as just, you know, Sydney's abstraction and Melbourne is figurative, but this kind of opposition continues and sustains itself through extended debates and even now to the contemporary moment. Neither of those different approaches is any less modern, really, than the other. And there are also great examples of artists who move between figuration and abstraction. We've got Sam Fullbrook, who we'll look at a bit more carefully later in the lecture. And also I wanted to point towards Ian Fairweather, who for a period between late 50s and early 60s entered a period of purely abstract work before moving back into figurative motifs. Also, I mean, it's interesting to know that Sidney Nolan was also an abstract artist first and then becomes figurative as time goes on. So it's an interesting kind of push and pull within these two tendencies. But of course, very close by, almost opposite that wall of the Antipodeans, is this group of works by Ian Fairweather. Now, it's a couple of earlier works on that left-hand side, and then two of his later great works painted on Bribie Island. In these earlier works, like this work here, Bathing Scene, Bali, it's useful to remember that Fairweather was Slade School educated and taught by Henry Tonks, you know, wonderful artist who I think that you can definitely see the influence of within this grouping of figures in this work, these wonderfully rounded shapes of the women and this amazing kind of chalky palette that we see in these works. But Fairweather very quickly escapes from Europe and then leads a very peripatetic lifestyle. He travels to China, to Bali, Philippines and other places. And then in the last 20 years of his life, he settles in Brisbane. There he paints his late works. And we explored those works in my 2012 exhibition at Queensland Art Gallery. This idea is that he settled down in relative comfort on Bribie Island to work and to live. So that was Bali Bathing Scene, and here is the work Two Philippine Children, which are just wonderful. Now, Gethsemane, 1958. This is a relatively recent addition to the collection. It depicts Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion. And it also evokes that great European tradition of religious painting. It's come into the collection relatively recently to accompany Epiphany of 1962, which is not currently within this display. But these two major works demonstrate Fairweather's knowledge of and appreciation for the great treasures of actually Italian Quattrocento painting in the collection of London's National Gallery. Of course, you know, spending time there whilst he was studying at the Slade School, which is not very far away actually from that gallery. But of course, these works don't look like Renaissance works at all, but there are senses and hints of their relationship to these traditions of, you know, and these masterpieces of Western art. Now, this Fairweather's treatment of Gethsemane was poetically described by the art critic for the Sydney Morning Herald in 1958. The generously moving rhythms of the large linear structures are placed with the quickening combination of the lighter drawn symbols of the theme, while an undercurrent of vibrating smaller shapes sharpens the mood. It is rich and darkly sonorous. Now, the works that have been recalled in terms of being having some kind of compositional consistency with Fairweather's work is Andrea Mantegna's The Agony in the Garden of 1458 to 60, and Bellini's also Agony in the Garden of 1465. So in the foreground, I'm sure these paintings, you know, I must emphasize, they reward a lot of contemplation. And I don't seem to be able to get my cursor to move over the image, but what I will do is point out that you can, if you spend a bit of time with this work, you can see that the kneeling figure of Christ takes up almost the entire composition. and there is an image of a cup towards the middle and left-hand side, and maybe beneath that the suggestion of an outstretched hand of Christ within the garden. So I'd suggest that you spend some time with this image and see whether some of these elements might start presenting themselves to you. Now, Fairweather commented in an interview in 1962, "To me, painting is a personal thing. It gives the same kind of satisfaction that religion, I imagine, gives to some people." And so whilst in that statement, he's not declaring particularly religious outlook, but the work was actually a finalist in the Blake Prize in 1959. And in 1961, it was acquired by the renowned Australian author Patrick White, who donated it to the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 1974. It had hung above Patrick White's writing desk for many years. And White was very much an admirer of Fairweather's work for that commitment to his art. And his novel, The Vivisector of 1970, which was about a reclusive artist, interestingly, kind of borrows aspects of Fairweather's life for its main character. Then, of course, the Art Gallery of New South Wales a few years ago, if you'd like to do some Googling, they decided to de-accession this work because they had their eyes on another work by Fairweather that they wanted to acquire, that they felt fit their collection better, more suitably, and sent it to auction. And it was purchased by Philip Bacon, as we see in the credit line here, who, well, he bought it in 2010, but then donated it to the Queensland Art Gallery's collection, and now it sits on our walls here in Queensland, which is a great and a wonderful achievement for that collection. Now, next to it is Kite Flying, which is also a work from Bribie Island. It was similar scale, where you can even see the outline of here that there are 4 panels of composition board that have been used in order to make this work. And here it's inspired by another great influence in Fairweather's work, which is Chinese calligraphy. And it's based on actually a Chinese kite festival celebrating the protection of loved ones against misfortune. As the story goes, the man was, Huan Qing, was warned by a sage to take his wife and children to the mountains, and he took his family kite flying, and so escaped a massacre that had happened and befell their livestock. So the energy of this work is pretty incredible, and I suppose it is a little more figurative. We can see the sense of outlines of children's faces. We can see the shapes of the kites in the top part of the picture, and throughout there is this wonderfully free kind of calligraphic line that we see throughout the work. Now, Fairweather at this time was living by himself. He's chosen a community that was a long way from the mainland. And remember, Brisbane of this period is very much a kind of cultural outpost in a way. We didn't have, our Queensland Art Gallery didn't have a permanent home. He must have thought that there was very little for him within the city, but Bribie Island gives him the kind of solitude and space that he needed in order to settle and paint. So I also wanted to, within the context of this work, highlight the recently published book of Ian Fairweather's letters. So this incredible collection of letters gives us a really great insight into Fairweather's process and communication with all sorts of individuals, with artists, with members of his family, with his dealers, with friends. And actually also interestingly puts paid to this sense that he was a complete kind of hermit or recluse. He really wasn't. He was writing letters all the time. He was in constant contact. I think it was just more of a case of an artist who chose to deal with the world on his own terms, and was very kind of resolute within that approach. But I must move on very quickly. Okay, now just to start concluding today's lecture, I wanted to draw your attention to two great portraits within the collection. The first is the Cypriot of 1940, a portrait of Aegis Gabrielides, a Cypriot waiter who'd worked in a London cafe frequented by Dobell in the 30s. So he modelled regularly for Dobell and his artist friends. William Dobell, of course, a wonderful artist and a wonderful portraitist. Dobell's early sketches kind of give us no sense of what this painting ends up kind of being. You know, this is an incredibly imposing character, I think, and a very carefully constructed portrait. QAGOMA's conservators have actually examined this work under the microscope and with x-rays, and Michaela's going to pop a link to that within the chat, and have revealed, you know, sketches for a different work underneath. But of course, you know, this work also signals Dobell's relationship with portraiture and the Archibald Prize, that very disappointing incident within Australian art history, where in 1944, some disgruntled artists sued the trustees of the Art Gallery of New South Wales over their decision to award the prize to Dobell's, arguing that that portrait of Joshua Smith was a caricature. Now, Dobell's response here is really interesting. He says, "You might say, I'm trying to create something instead of copying something when I set out to paint a portrait. To me, a sincere artist is not one who makes a faithful attempt to put on a canvas what is in front of him, but one who tries to create something which is a living thing in itself, regardless of the subject." And I think that statement and sentiment is absolutely at play within this incredibly powerful work. And we see here that, you know, this is also the reflecting of the influence of modernism within Australia. Hierarchies and the sense of the proper subjects for art, for portraits, are really changing, and the proper ways that we should be treating these genres like portraiture are changing, and many people are struggling quite a lot with this influence. Now, the next work, just briefly, is Sam Fulbrook's portrait of Ernestine Hill from 1970. Ernestine Hill was Brisbane born, and this portrait was commissioned by her son Robert. And this work itself was a finalist in the 1970 Archibald Prize, but unfortunately didn't win. Completely robbed, as a not very good work by Eric Smith actually won the prize that year. But then Fulbrook's portrait of the jockey Whopper Stevens was awarded the prize in 1974. But this is a wondrous work. Fulbrook had a great affection for Hill, and he saw her as a kind of embodiment of an earlier age. Their friendship developed while they were both living in Buderim, and they discovered that they'd had a shared history of life on the land and appreciation of the Australian bush. And in this work, you know, the figure seems to float upwards. She looks dignified, but she also looks very frail, as if she's kind of slipping into the background. This blue dress with these amazing dots of yellowish, mustardy kind of colour that almost are floating away from her dress. And her arm suggests that she's wearing gloves, but apparently she never actually wore gloves. That might have been an invention of Fulbrook's himself. And then we see the strength of this blunt fringe of the dark hair and this wonderful splash of red lipstick, this introspective gaze. I just think it's one of the most wonderful portraits within Australian art, full stop, and it's an absolute gem within the gallery's collection. Hi, Julie.
Good morning.
Oh, great. I can hear you and see you. Thanks so much for joining us today, Julie. Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from the north of Brisbane today. It's kind of grey and overcast.
Yep, excellent. And you're not in your studio. I can see you're in a different kind of environment, a bit cleaner and neater. So Julie, you're very much a painter, which is kind of interesting in terms of thinking about the lecture that we've talked about today, which has been actually mostly paintings. I've tried to talk a bit more about the history of objects and decorative arts within Australian art history, but it kind of ends up landing on painting quite a lot. And we'd really love to hear a bit a discussion from you about some of these works. I thought we might start with these three particular works, which are in Queensland Art Gallery's collection. And, you know, interestingly, on the right-hand side here, we see that you've actually got a portrait, a work, a kind of that references Gustave Courbet, who is really considered to be, I mean, I don't mention him in the lecture, but considered to be a father of modernism, you know, but from France, kind of mid 19th century, his work, not so much through the kind of particularly style of painting, but it's the subject matter really within Courbet's work that is so revolutionary of that time. So maybe you could talk to us about this series and that connection and that inspiration for these works.
Sure. So this was a series of works, there are three of, I think, a series of 7 that were made in response to a show called Optimism that was at QAGOMA in 2009. And at the time, so we were invited to participate in the show. And at the time, I'd just come back from seeing Courbet's big show at the Musée Fabre in France. And so Courbet's always been a huge inspiration for me. One, because of the subject matter. He's absolutely centrally concerned with human themes, as I am. But secondly, because he sort of loves to pick at the surface and play with the surface. And, you know, he's sort of an incredible formalist as well. So I was really inspired by Courbet, but at the same time, sometimes we can be too inspired to the point of being sort of, what would we say, paralyzed. So when I came back from France, I just thought, I can never make another painting again in a certain way. But because I'd been asked to do this thing about optimism, I started to think, well, how does optimism in a way relate to, say, inspiration? So there's a sort of like looking forward that is attached to inspiration and optimism. So I started to play with the double side of inspiration, I guess. So it sort of took a sideways move. And at the same time, this way that I was relating to feeling kind of defeated by Courbet reminded me on a personal level, and this is often a thing I do, like make attachments with broader things to what's happening immediately in front of me, to this sort of weird dynamic that had started to run in my family where I felt responsible for getting everybody out of bed in the morning. So this series is called Get Up. And there's a sort of an inverse relationship with my encouragement and everybody else's desire to get out of bed. I mean, this is a really banal kind of a starting point for a series of paintings in a way. So anyway, I took a collection of Courbet's works and snapshots from my family home, all languid characters, and used painting in a way to formally prop them up. So I don't know if that makes any sense. There's this sort of like, yeah, double thing of reality versus playing around with that in a formal way.
Yeah, I mean, so for everybody who's watching, you know, this is the correct orientation of these works, isn't it? So, and what you've done really interestingly is to kind of, you know, everybody's particularly that's a self-portrait of you in the middle.
Correct. Yeah.
And there's your partner at the time, you know, lying down. But what you've done is, you know, you've kind of skewed our viewpoint of these works in terms of trying to work out where are these resting, what are these figures doing? And this is all through the kind of manipulation of paint. So you've used photographs as your starting point. Maybe you could talk a bit about that kind of process, Julie?
So I guess that even since art school, I have been interested in that relationship between painting and photography. And because, like Courbet, I guess, I'm interested in everyday reality, there's something about the aesthetic of snapshot photography in particular that I was very attracted to, like borrowing that truthiness in a way from the snapshot to use it with painting. And, you know, that was a common trope, has been a lot of common trope of a lot of artists since the 60s and 70s. But so that was my starting point. We'll see when we go on that that's kind of evolved, but I still love to keep a foot in that camp, even as the works become different. I love that aesthetic of, it sort of seems to root the painting in a time and place that I really like.
Mm. And I mean, these are very much kind of easel-sized works, you know, 60 by 40 centimeters. How do you paint, Julie? Are you painting them on an easel, sitting up, or tabletop?
Oh no, always, yeah, sitting up. And I think that was part of the formal thing too with these. You know, we talked about this yesterday, Angela, that we often forget the paintings are vertical. We sort of take it for granted that they're vertical. So when a reclining figure is shown vertically, they are sort of being propped up in a way. And I guess these paintings were playing with that in a sense too.
Playing with that. And at the same time, they're very, you know, they're so painterly, and the surfaces are often quite built up. You know, you revel in this, well, and it's oil paint, you know, it's the classic medium of painters. And I can just get this sense that you love the materiality of paint itself in the way that it works. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to a more recent work, which is the single bed. Now, that's in the Griffith University's art collection. I must be very proud of. This work is much larger, and, you know, here we have this incredible kind of layering. I just suggest to everybody to spend a bit of time just really, you know, paying attention to these layers. Maybe you could talk us through this composition, Julie, and the impetus for this work. Also very autobiographical.
So it was a work that I made for the National Portrait Prize Self-Portrait Prize at University of Queensland Art Museum. And so the self-portraits in my work, they're a sort of a concurrent recurring thing that while I'm exploring other things, occasionally there'll be these sort of one-off standalone self-portraits, and this is the one that I made on the year of my 40th birthday, and it's a little bit sarcastic and a little bit bitter in a kind of way. It's called...
Kind of highlight the little lovely little bit of bunting around your neck.
That's right. It's, what is the title of it? Yeah, The Single Bed, or Cheers to 40 Years. And it's really, I mean, but in basic terms, about finding yourself being 40 and single. You know, this is what wasn't the way that expected life to go. But I'd also just come back from, this is another sort of inspiration moment, where I'd been in Venice and seen the Philip Guston show in 2019. And I'd said, oh no, that wasn't 2000, must have been the one before that. It was just before then.
It was 2017.
Yeah. And I'd seen that great painting of his called Couple in Bed that came from 1977, which is the year of my birth too, which is a nice sort of thing. So I guess I wanted to make a painting that felt like the experience of being single. And, you know, there's lots and lots of great things about being single, but sometimes it's awful. Sometimes you feel like there's not a lot supporting you. So I wanted to make a painting that felt like that. I guess some of the, like, do you want to talk about the process, or like?
Yeah, and I mean, this layering that you've introduced within these more recent works, I just find that fascinating. You know, you're really demonstrating this kind of virtuosity in terms of your ability to, you know, layer works, but why do you choose to do these and that? And yeah, maybe a few of the different iconographical elements.
Yeah.
Right.
So I guess I started, because the works are so psychological, I suppose at a certain point I started to want to make paintings that felt more like a psychological space. So the photographs are great in terms of rooting the painting in reality, but I also wanted to get a sense, more of a feeling, I guess an internal feeling. And I feel like the human mind, or the way that my mind operates, it's a bit of a mess. It's not so straightforward, right? So in order for a painting to feel like the thing that you're trying to talk about to do with human experience, it needs to in some way have more chaos, be more like the Cubists in a certain way, to show many perspectives at once. So I started, on the one hand, hanging on to this photographic subject matter for its truthiness, as I said before, but on the other hand, wanting to sort of bring them together to create a fuller sense. So you can see there's the black shape around the outside is almost like a sort of sarcophagus or a coffin shape. I'm laying on a flat on a bed. So this is from a photograph that my daughter took looking straight down. And again, the painting is physically props up that figure so that they're laying on the wall. You can see that there's a doona that's covered in cats, like, you know, the old cliche of the old cat lady. And what else is there? There's like, there are disembodied feet that are laying amongst the bricks down the bottom, and vultures waiting to eat them, all sorts of uplifting things like that. But I also here, this is one of my favourite parts of the work, where my hands are holding my own hands. And there's a sense when I've spoken to other people who are feeling like they're single, and not just single, I think actually this extends to all of our singularity, whether we're in relationships or not, this sense of just trying desperately to hold on to yourself at certain points. So I liked that idea of these sort of giant hands and little hands.
I mean, you're incredibly honest, Julie, and it's just such a, life in all of its complexity, you know, is really demonstrated within this work. I have another self-portrait of you that is next, that you've just done this year. I mean, I don't want to give everybody the impression that you just make self-portraits, but they're always just so incredibly compelling to me. So I wanted to show everybody this very recent image. Can you talk about this one maybe?
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
So I guess this is a much straighter one and indicative of the time. I feel like at the moment there's so much noise, and so almost there's just too much going on, and it's almost more than any of us can manage. And so I probably wanted to strip it back and go for something more direct. So again, as I said, just the self-portraits is kind of checking in. So it was about a year since my last, 3 years since my last one. And this one's called There Goes the Floor, Self-Portrait 2020, which is a sort of way, I guess, that I've summarised what 2020 feels like collectively, that the floor's just dropped out of everything.
Yeah.
And I felt like in a certain way after I'd made this, it's a kind of neutral portrait. It's me, but it's kind of deadpan in a way. And it feels to me more like a collective psychological experience than, say, others that are more rooted in my autobiography. I mean, we're all sharing this sense at the moment, and I suppose I wanted to make a self-portrait that was more universal in that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're very barefaced. You've got an extremely just neutral expression. It's a dark background. There's no detail, but it's that process of checking in with yourself is really, really kind of interesting. But just to move on to your most, and here very quickly, this is a whole other aspect of your practice, which you've done a couple of these just very recently, which is commission portraits. I'm sure it's just a whole nother hugely interesting and complex, interesting way of being asked to depict someone. And of course, everybody, this is Anna Bligh's official parliamentary portrait, you know, the kind of process of thinking through that particular history and the way that this work will interact with all of the other portraits within, you know, Queensland's Parliament House must have been just quite an interesting process. Yeah.
It was a really positive process, actually. I had a lot of respect for Anna Bligh before I met her, and that only continued through the process. And she had quite a clear vision about not what the painting should look like, but the feeling that it should have. And I took the opportunity, I guess, to include some things about her that stood out as her time as Premier. So there's an image that's taken from the Brisbane River during the floods that's in the background. There are the strings of the Karulpa Bridge. There's the architecture of QAGOMA out the back down near the river. And I think there's even some details in her watch about some of the educational reforms that she was a part of. So, yeah, Look, it was a great experience. I was very happy with the portrait. So was Anna. It doesn't always go that well, but that was a great one.
Yes, well, as we've seen with, well, and that's the artists like Doe Bell, demonstrate that. It's always a fraught process. But now this is your most recent series of works, which this is the second in a kind of series, Julie, that you've used. Well, perhaps let you explain this work and maybe the context with the earlier work with the Supreme Court. It'd be great to hear.
Yes, after working autobiographically, which is not to say diaristically, I guess I use personal experience to talk about universal themes for a long time. It started to be a bit draining, I guess, and I wanted to start outside and work back in. So take the position of the observer, witness, and then see how I could channel that through my own interpretation to bring out something of the experiences of others, and I guess the felt experiences of others was what I was looking for. So I started, and Angela, you were a part of this experience as well, by sitting in on 2 murder trials at the Supreme Court of Queensland and making 2 bodies of work about that. I think there's still some, you can see on my website the images for that, and you can also see at the Supreme Court of Queensland website, I think there's a podcast from our public program there if anyone's interested. But this, I guess, having been in the court, and it's incredibly public, on the one hand it's private, but there are media cameras, it's all of the things that happen there, many of the things that happen there are written about in newspapers. It's a sort of way that the court belongs to the public. And so I started thinking about not just that, but about how do institutions rub up against felt human experience. Like you go to a legal trial and you see that the decisions of lawmakers have minuscule but profound effects on the real lives of people who come into contact with them. And I wanted to head more towards that human element in another institution, which was the hospital. So earlier this year, fortunately before the coronavirus happened, Philip Hall at St Andrew's War Memorial Hospital was kind enough to allow me to follow him in his surgeries. And so I spent about a week just observing and made a series of paintings from that.
So were you sitting in on the surgeries, or how did that, what were you allowed to access in that process?
Yeah, so I was able to access the surgery. So I sat on the side, much in the manner of, say, a medical student who's observing, and I made notes. That was the extent. So it wasn't so much about gathering images as much as gathering what does this feel like from the perspective of particular participants. So this work is called Baby Dreaming, and it's about seeing a lot of operations that were about women trying to check out or rescue their fertility in order to be able to have babies. It's a really, really common but really, really profound and difficult experience for many women in Australia. So there was, I guess this is different to the earlier works in the sense that I used to start with photographs. So I'd see a photograph that seemed poignant, and it's sort of flipped now to the point where I wait for a feeling of something, like almost like what would the feeling of a kind of hunger or desperation to become a mother look like if it were a painting? And then the concrete images start to be sort of brought together in and around that sketch. I make drawings and stuff first, that makes sense. So I wanted in this painting to, I suppose, you can see on the outside, it's almost like there's the ovaries up in the top left that are tied with bows. And then the ball gown sort of image is ultrasound photograph. And the head of what is the mother is actually an ovarian cyst. But I wanted to create a sense in the work of all of the energy of not just the woman, but the surgeons and this whole apparatus of the institution exploding from that part of the woman's body. So I just wanted to,
And you've layered all sorts of images and elements. You've kind of played with perspective, and you know, we can't quite see which way is up. I've heard you say before, Julie, this really profound thing about, you know, it's interesting you said you didn't work with photographs for this work, and you said to me once, you can't take a painting. You know, you can take a photograph, but you can't take a painting. It needs a kind of different kind of engagement. Maybe you could talk.
Oh, no, that's not me. That's Marlene Dumas. That's me. Yeah. Yeah. No, painting has to.
Idea a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's not. Paintings have a totally different relationship with time. So, yeah, a photograph is an extraction. So, you know, time moves and a photograph is extracted. And she says that painting recycles time. So in a certain way, it's still an extraction from sort of what, I don't know, Nicholas Mertzov calls it the midst of contemporary consumption. You know, everything just bowls along, but painting is sort of like yanks something out of there. She says that in that time circulates, and, you know, it does. And that energy, that way that energy runs around the surface is something I'm very, very mindful of. So it's like painting has a finite amount of energy, and you've got to be very careful to keep it circulating inside in some ways.
Absolutely. I think I've got one more image of the work from that series. Maybe you could talk about the table, much straighter image in a way. Yeah. Yeah,
and it was made at a similar time as that recent self-portrait as well. So I'm getting kind of interested in these dark blacks in a way that they can sort of, or they compress in a kind of way, whatever it is that's inside them. So I extracted this image from a photograph I took of an empty operating theatre at St Andrews. And it was something in that horizontal plane that reminded me, I guess, of a body's death, or at the very least, a kind of body as object. Or it's like in the catalogue for the show that these will be a part of, I said, like body as meat object. One of the most interesting things from that experience of being in the operating theatre was seeing the way that a person would go from being a speaking, breathing, conscious person to a meat object and then out again. And this sort of like almost arbitrary delineation between the conscious and the unconscious. And I liked the way that it seemed to refer to me in a sort of way like to Warhol's electric chair paintings.
Yeah.
You know, to Hans Holbein's Dead Christ painting. There's sort of like, it felt like it had a lot of art historical precedence as well.
So you are conscious as you're constructing compositions, as you're working through your work, of these kinds of artistic antecedents and, you know, heroes or artists that you want to push and pull against within.
Sometimes, but they mostly come later. So it's like you make the painting and then you think, oh my God, I've accidentally made a Warhol. So we're all continually informed or educated in a way in what we see and what we notice in like quite subconscious ways. I'm still figuring out what this painting's about. You know, sometimes takes some time for the painting to tell you what it was actually doing.
Yeah, great. Well, and the next image I have is of your studio in the process of these works being painted. We've had a few questions that are kind of very much about your process. So maybe you could talk about, you know, what when you start with a blank canvas, how do you start in terms of the process?
So I've done myself the disservice of adding two huge new elements. The first thing is long periods of observation and note-taking that when I work from snapshots were unnecessary. The next thing is a long period of image acquisition and then playing around digitally on the computer. So all of these compositions for the next show are sort of a couple of weeks worth of image accumulate. So I might say, okay, I'm going to need 10 bows, I'm going to need 15 earthworms, I'm going to need whatever. And I collect all those images, you know, online and from different sources, put them all through an editing system. So I've got them all cut up, and it's almost like it's a digital collaging kind of situation. that I then work on for a period of time. And then I transfer the digital image onto the support and then start the process of painting it from there. And then along the way, and this is the reason why partway through this exhibition, you can see some of them are half done and still sitting around, is because then sometimes you think you've done it and then you look at it a week later and you think, no, that's not working. One of the reasons I work on board is so that you can scrape it off and redo certain parts, you know, reprime, regesso and redo certain parts. So there's another editing system that goes on after that too.
I'm interested with this series that there's this incredible, like there's this lovely pink kind of layer within. They're never, and your works are never just black and white. You always introduce these kind of interesting tones within. Why are you doing that?
I don't know exactly, except that I can say that the effect is almost like blood underneath the skin. So it gives a life to the greys. So the greys are never black and white. I don't own any black paint, but they're always mixed greys. So they have some warmth in them, but it's that magenta underneath. I get a lot of satisfaction with that, and it all change, you know. Looking at those Grace Crowley and Ralph Bolson paintings and things makes me think, you know, I have to go back to colour at some point. Not really quite yet, but.
But that magenta is so interesting too, because I mean, that's part of the kind of, that to me, magenta, I think of printing processes and publications and books, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of, yeah. And is it that kind of magenta? Is it a pure?
It's called Quinacridone Magenta.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know what the relationship is with publishing with that.
I just love it. And yes, of course, that sentiment about talking about blood under the skin, you know, I think that your paintings are able to crack through, you know, a kind of surface, and are always can be sometimes confronting, always very visceral experiences.